Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's session of the F Word, where we'll be talking about feminism and class. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. This evening we have two guests who almost need no introduction. We have Dr. Anne Summers, AO, who is a best-selling author, journalist and thought leader with a long career in politics, the media, business and the non-government sector in Australia, Europe and the United States. Her latest book, and you'll all be aware that she has many, is The Misogyny Factor, which we'll be talking about a bit this evening, published by New South. So welcome, Anne. Thank you. Next we have Alice Pung, who has her lovely son with her this evening, who I'm sure will be the star of the show. Alice is the best-selling author of Her Father's Daughter, which won the 2012 Western Australia Premier's Literary Awards, An Unpolished Gem, which won the 2007 Australian Book Industry Newcomer of the Year Award, and is also published in the UK, Germany, Indonesia and the US. She's also the editor of Growing Up Asian in Australia, and her latest book, which we will be talking about this evening a bit, is called Riverina. Welcome, Alice.
Thanks,
I wanted to begin, we've started all of the other topics by really talking a little bit about where the panellists are coming from in terms of topic. So one of the things that happened in the lead up to this event in Melbourne, I don't know if you've all been following it, but there was a Facebook group for VCE students in Victoria, which was visited by all different kinds of students from schools across Victoria. And there was an exchange in this group between private school students and public school students, which was quite a horrendous exchange with students of a particular private school in Melbourne talking about how, you know, their parents are the bosses of the public school students and how the public school students were going to live these kind of poverty-stricken lives. And it was very well publicised. And so I started thinking about the time in which we actually recognise class, you know, the time in which we actually think about what we have and what other people around us have, whether that happens in primary school, whether it happens in high school. And that's the first question I want to direct to the panellists. I guess I'll start with you, Alice. Your book, Riverina, takes place in a high school. It's about a young Asian Australian student who receives a scholarship to a private school where she encounters really quite similar behaviour to what was going on in that Facebook group. So I'm interested, I guess, in knowing a little bit about your childhood and the time in which you first really thought about class.
Thanks, Maxine. Well, what's been interesting since Riverina came out last year was that in, you know, almost every interview I've done about the book, the interviewer has always asked, so is this based on any real school in Melbourne or Australia? Which private school is it? Come on. Is it Lauriston? It starts with L. Is it MLC? So they've been very obsessed about working out which private school this book is based on, and the private school is completely fictional. However, no one has ever asked about the suburb in which my main character comes from, which is completely non-fictional. So the suburb of Stanley in my book is the suburb of Braybrook in Melbourne, where I grew up, which is right next to the suburb of Sunshine. This is the industrial relations heartland. It was where the Harvester decision was made, which you know, gave minimum wages. It was the first minimum wage decision in the world. So it's a very working class neighbourhood in which I grew up, where you had two distinct groups of people. So the old working class, which was people like the wonderful social worker Les Twentyman and his family. He calls them the old Braybrook families. And then the new groups of people who came in the late 70s and 80s because of our, you know, more liberal, more open immigration policies. So there was always a conflict between those two types of people. You had what the media would call those bogans in Braybrook, and then you had what were called the Bogasians, which were a notch lower than the bogans, the newly arrived So that is where I'm coming from, and that's where I grew up and where I was born. But class, for me, as I talked to Maxine before, isn't necessarily just about having money, because, you know, Australians like to make fun of the cubs, the cashed up bogans, and my parents are quite well off now, but my mother doesn't read anything I've written because the only literature she reads used to come twice a week. She'd go from the garage where she worked as an outworker to the front of the house, and she'd open up the letterbox, and she would read the Safeway buy low and Bess and Less ads, because that was the only literature she could read. She was not literate. So in one generation, it's been a huge leap for me. Yeah.
Thank you. And you grew up in the Riverina, a large family. Was class something that you were aware of as a young girl?
Well, actually, I was born in the Riverina in Deniliquin, but as a very small baby, a bit old, a bit younger than Leo here. I was taken off to Adelaide, so I grew up in Adelaide, and which is where my father's family was from. And I guess my experience was a little bit different, well, very different, obviously, and I'm not sure that it's all that unusual, but my family was very, and particularly my mother, very resolutely middle class. I mean, very, very determined to keep up appearances and to project an image of respectability and the way things ought to be, but we had no money. And so it was often a little bit hard to maintain this charade. But if I ever suggested to my mother that we were anything but middle class, she would be so upset. And I think this is very common amongst, certainly in my generation. I hear a few agreements from the audience that very common that the aspirations weren't matched by the income. And in our case, it was because my father drank a lot, and a lot of the money should have gone to pay the electricity bill, went to other things. So, and that was sort of my experience of growing up. That it was always a huge struggle, but there was no way we would ever think of ourselves as working class because we were very respectable. And so, it's I think class is a bit complicated, particularly in Australia, where it's to do with money, it's to do with status, it's to do with the job you have, it's to do with the way you dress, all of these things. Or it used to be perhaps much more so, in the 1950s when I was growing up. And I think today it's even more confused and confusing because everybody tends to dress the same. So whether your T-shirt costs $200 or $10, you're still wearing a T-shirt. And people there is this great kind of egalitarianism in the way people tend to look and the cars they drive and the food that we eat and all of that stuff. So I think it's a bit more complex than perhaps it used to be.
Yeah. We were talking in the green room, Alice, about that moment for myself as well, of going to law school or enrolling in a law degree and suddenly realising there's this whole class of people that you never even knew existed, kind of going, what world is this? And in a sense, you have kind of had that kind of, I won't say class mobility, but you've seen that malleability of class. Is it something that, as a woman, you feel it's difficult to negotiate?
Yeah, so Maxine and I both went to law school. We're both lawyers. But Maxine, you probably have similar experiences. When I first went for job interviews, I didn't understand class that well. And Anne talks about how people dress similarly these days. Not so when you reach a certain class, because my father, who was very kind to me and who worked at Retrovision, gave me a folder to keep my resume in. It had Panasonic in it, and he said, this is, genuine leather. You'll look really classy for your interviews. And then I wore very tacky things. I didn't know when I was 22 that you don't wear a lot of gold for your interviews if you want to look, respectable, and your suit shouldn't be polyester. It's these subtle differences that you don't understand until you're around a particular group of people long enough that you think, oh, okay, they're wearing very simple clothes, but their shirt is cashmere and their pants are organic cotton, your jeggings from Kmart don't quite do the trick. So we do look the same, but the subtle differences are sometimes enormous and very transparent when you go for an interview not understanding. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's been 40 years since your book, Damned Whores and God's Police, was published. And in The Misogyny Factor, and also in your previous book, The End of Equality, you talk about how a lot of the gains that were made in the mid-70s in terms of women's rights have been slowly eroded by the Howard government and by various repeals of legislation. Do you feel that class was more of a consideration in the 70s in terms of legislating for women than it is today?
Well, it's a huge question, and Maxine, I'll try to answer it briefly because we could be here all night talking about that. But I think that there are, I think certainly as somebody who's been involved in women's policy for a long time and used to work in government, you know, whenever we would be talking about, for example, childcare policy or, you know, single parent payments or, you know, work-related programs or training or whatever the program was, we would always be very conscious of the needs of low-income women, and whether they were low-income because they didn't have jobs or because their jobs weren't well paid or whatever, that would certainly be a consideration. And I think that's always a consideration in government policy making, and I think it still is today. The difference is whether or not the government of the day cares about it. And it's been quite obvious with the Abbott government, you know, with their first budget, that they were quite prepared to sacrifice whole groups of people and basically, you know, rip the income away from them in order to achieve pretty much ideological aims. Now, Malcolm Turnbull, the new Prime Minister, is going around saying that it's all going to be about fairness, and so he's, you know, intimating that he's going to be different. So, you know, we shall see. But I do think that there is a very long established tradition in this country of policy making, and particularly social policy making, that does take different income stratas into account. Now, whether or not it's done in a way that we always agree with, you know, for example, Julia Gillard's very controversial changes to single parent pension, which I remember when I did the event with her in Melbourne Town Hall a couple of years ago, she was booed by the audience when she talked about it. The audience basically loved her for everything else, but very, very upset about that. Now, she had a rationale for that, and she has this very strong view that it's important that women be lifted out of poverty, and you do that through work. And that was a very unpopular point of view. But you can't say she wasn't mindful of low-income women. She just had a different approach than was popular with a lot of people.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, it's always a consideration, I think, but it's what individual governments or individual political leaders do with it, which is sort of what we should be monitoring.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to read a little extract from a report. It's a report that came out of England 3 years ago, but I'd say it's probably still quite relevant here. It's from the Institute of Public Policy Research. It says, while the average gap between the earnings of men and women has narrowed in the last 50 years, differences between professional and unskilled women are significantly higher than those between the same groups of men. Women with a degree born in 1958 earned more than 3 times as much as women in unskilled jobs. So I think the difference of 3 times as much, whereas for the men, between the unskilled men and men who had a university degree, there was about a 45% wage difference. So there's an argument being made, I think, certainly in the UK and also here in terms of commentary, that working class women have been forsaken or their lot has not been advanced as much by feminism as we would like. So I guess I wanted to ask Alice, in terms of your engagement with feminism and feminist issues and the time in your life at which you started to engage with them, do you feel like people like your mother, you know, who was, you know, a low-income worker, had the benefit of the gains of the feminist movement in terms of her life?
Well, you know, she was in a different country, so she was uprooted from Cambodia because of the Holocaust. Feminism has had many gains, but I think my mother was one of the ones that slipped through the holes just because she was invisible, not just to feminism, but to society. She worked in a garage 14-hour days, you know, making jewellery as an outworker. And she used to tell us that we couldn't tell anyone because the government would take her away and we'd be fostered out. Now, she had no understanding of the law or that she was being exploited. All she knew was she was getting paid cash in hand and she wasn't paying taxes, so she was a lawbreaker. She didn't understand that, you know, if you're an outworker, it's usually you're not at fault for being exploited. So we grew up not understanding these things very much, keeping her work a secret. So I think she was one of those people who slipped through the gaps. And it was only after I got an education that I even realised, in my first year of university, that what she did was outworking, because I went to a meeting by a group called Socialist Alternative, and we sat around in a circle, and I felt really enlightened by the socialists because they talked about it. There was a word for it, but then all their attention came to me because they realised I had an outworker's daughter sitting there, and they wanted to discuss how disempowering it was and what a really terrible job my mother was, you know, and how exploited she was. But that work gave her a sense of purpose. It gave her an income, and she considered herself a businesswoman. So if you took that work away from her, which eventually she had to stop doing because she was getting blurry eyesight, this cough that never went away, and her joints were aching, she fell into a deep depression because she lost her purpose. So it's not as simple as outworkers are being exploited, so take the work away from them or make sure they're getting paid fairly. It's very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was working at the Office of the Status of Women, which is, you know, back in the 1980s, when the Hawke government was in power. And at that time, I think Jenny George had just become the president of the ACTU, first woman president. And I know there was definitely moves by the trade union movement to try and, you know, deal with the issue of outworkers and how to kind of bring them into the industrial relations system in a way. And I know that it was basically textiles, clothing and footwear, which were threatened industries anyway because of what was happening with the tariffs. But it was incredibly hard. But I do think people were trying to do it, and I think they did what they could. Yeah. But I think Alice's point is very important. That, I mean, it's very easy for us to look at somebody who's doing something which is different and perhaps even repellent to us, but if they're happy doing it or if they get something out of it, our role should be really to ensure that they're not exploited and that their pay is better and their conditions are better, rather than to just condemn them for doing that, I think.
Yeah, and sometimes it's migrants exploiting other migrants because they don't see it as exploitation. So you might have an outworker who's done a lot of work and then can invest in more sewing machines and then start their own little factory as an independent contractor, offering newly arrived migrants a job which they will gladly take. So there's many levels. Yeah.
Well, I think it is very different from the kind of maybe the old, maybe the way it was in the, I don't know how far back we want to go, but, when there was the working class and, the middle class and maybe not so much here the upper class, but it's all a bit more fluid now. And I think education has obviously had a huge impact on that. I mean, I was the first person in my family to go to university and, I had the same experience of meeting the kids of very rich people and thinking, oh, well, okay. But I was involved in politics from the very beginning, and all the rich people I met were all socialists and Marxists, so, didn't really matter. We hated their money and they hated their money, and, if they were willing to pay for drinks at the pub, well, that was great.
Wow.
And in the misogyny factor, you talk about the two essentials really for a woman's independence, and that is their own economic means and the ability to choose when and if they have children. And given we have a baby here today, I wanted to talk about some of the discussion in your book around childcare and this issue of affordable childcare, appropriate childcare. You talk about this vision where the children of the future will look back and say, wasn't it crazy that our mothers, got off work at 5 and school finished at 3 and those kinds of things. What do you feel can be done at a policy level in terms of alleviating the stress on childcare?
I mean, it's not that hard, really. And I mean, I just think it's just one of these. Now, to me, childcare is an absolute gateway issue. You know, unless childcare is available, women who have children, and you know, it shouldn't just be the woman whose life is disrupted by having children. I mean, it takes two to make the baby, and I think the responsibility for raising that baby and should be shared equally, and that means that the father of the baby should also have his work disrupted, and you know, that should be shared. But I know that's a very utopian view, and that doesn't really happen very. Okay, we can all point to a couple of families where it happens, but it's not the norm. What I find extraordinary, and it's something that I have observed in federal politics, you know, ever since the early 80s when I was working in OSW, is the extraordinary hostility to childcare policy, particularly from a lot of men on the left. And, you know, it's such a clear indicator of their deep down refusal to accept that women should be equal, because this is a way of helping to ensure that, and they want to make sure that it won't happen. And we've had childcare policies been through so many, you know, permutations over the years, and I find what's happening at the moment probably the worst example of anything I've observed in 40 years, and that is the current government, and this was set an Abbott thing, but Turnbull seems to be going ahead with it. The current government is requiring women to choose between childcare and paid parental leave. So the government is saying, well, okay, if you want this U-Butte childcare policy, which we've got, we're not going to tell you what it is, but it's fantastic, but it's really expensive, and we can't afford it unless we cut paid parental leave. Now, I just think no other area of policy does this happen. No other group in society is asked to choose between two sets of entitlements. So why is this happening with women and with childcare? And to me, it is just a further example of the fact that the governments do not take this seriously, and they do not want women to have full equality. I think it's an absolute scandal.
I several months ago.
That's not saying what I think should happen. I can think that's what is happening, and that's what's so horrible. Yeah.
Several months ago, I was picking my daughter up from childcare, and I remember just turning around and seeing this room full of like crazy children, and saying to the room leader of her childcare, who's a Muslim Egyptian woman, I don't know how you do this. You know, you guys are just angels. I don't understand. And her response really shocked me. She just said, mothers don't say that to me. You know, it's always about, you know, my child hasn't had lunch, or my child's, you know, there's always criticism. And I thought, these people are so poorly paid. Most of the women in my daughter's childcare are migrant women of colour. And we seem to be fighting at the top end for affordable childcare. But at the same time, you know, if I go to a rally for childcare workers, the people there are childcare workers primarily. So for me, that was a real kind of, in terms of intersectionality and looking at these things that, you know, policy at the top does not necessarily lead to, you know, we're creating an underclass of these childcare workers who are doing the most important job while we go and do our jobs. And so I wanted to speak about intersectionality, Alice, and I guess the way that things like age or race or, you know, disability also feed into class, and they impact on the kind of jobs that are available to you, whether or not you're accepted into the middle class. Things like, you know, you talk about going for job interviews, and you know, the experience of things like having an ethnic name, you know, that might feed into, you know, whether someone offers you a job interview. So, I mean, what has been your experience of intersectionality and class in that kind of, I guess, job environment?
Oh, I've been lucky because, so my teenage years were spent in the early 90s and mid-90s, when, before she was on Dancing with the Stars, a certain politician said there were too many Asians. And, you know, a decade later, you see a lot of Asians on television, and now we're quite accepted because there's a new group of people to to hate, to put it simply. So we're the model minority. So we're considered highly educated, putting our kids through university. And I have a lot of friends who I went to law school with, or who became quite successful in their careers. They did everything right, they got good marks at university, but who never make it to leadership positions because they believed in the meritocracy, but they didn't understand that when you work in a larger firm, that it's the social things that determine how high you move, and the social things are the hobbies, whether you play golf, whether you play tennis, whether you go out drinking even. So if you're Muslim or if you're devoutly Buddhist, you don't go out drinking Friday nights, you go home to your family, and if you grew up as, say, a refugee or migrant, you've never played golf in your life, you don't understand this hobby, you probably didn't even have time for hobbies, so you're excluded that way. And so a lot of my friends tell me, we're just the quite hard-working people that get dumped with a lot of the work, and we don't have no idea how to get ahead, So it's a very interesting dilemma. You can do everything right, and you can still not have the leadership skills of extroversion and this idea of, pastimes that you have if you're leisured.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I must say, I recently did a couple of hours research on the subject of golf. Because I was going on a television program and I was asked to come up with something. Anyway, I decided. What I discovered is there are 250 golf clubs in Australia. 51% of them have fewer than 100 members. Only 7% of Australians play golf. So it's ridiculous, the amount of attention, the amount of status it has, the way it's a pathway to success. I agree with all that you're saying. It is such a distortion of our economy, of our land use, of the use of water. It is just unbelievable. I can go on. It is ridiculous. And I think, just if I can just continue your point from a slightly different point of view, that this idea about what you have to do to get ahead, it's also a problem for women of all classes who don't necessarily want to go lap dancing at lunchtime and, all these sorts of things. The habits of success that have been developed by a very small class of males to reward themselves and the people like them, and then they don't work for the rest of us. They simply don't. They don't work for most men either. They don't work. So the control that this very small group of people have on the stranglehold on the way in which you have to work or play in order to succeed, it's such a fraud, and I think more and more of us are seeing through it. But it needs to be dismantled, and I can't see that happening. And when I made these remarks about golf, it was on the drum on Friday night on ABC TV a few weeks ago. You can't believe the reaction. All these people writing, "Oh dear Anne, I've always admired your politics, but you're so wrong about golf. It's a really great sport, and my wife plays it too, and it's not sexist." I didn't say it was sexist. I just said it's obscene.
We're talking backstage, and I said that I'd chosen this topic because I felt like class was something that just was not talked about enough in Australian society, and you disagreed. So I'm wanting you to extrapolate, I guess, and on our dialogue around class and feminism in Australia, and I guess your perspective on...
Well, I guess I was making a couple of points. One is that I think that that class is sort of, as a construct, I'm not sure how useful it is. Politically, it can be, it's something that's always been with us politically, because the Labor Party is the party of the workers, or used to be. But I'm not sure how useful it is, because I guess the point I was making when we were chatting backstage was that we were talking about advertising, and how in advertising you only see people in big houses and wearing fancy clothes and driving fancy cars and all the rest of it. And I said, well, I think, and I just first of all disagree, because I think if you look at beer ads, that they are not nice working middle class people. I think that so much of advertising in this country is aspirational, and it's directed at the vast majority of people who aspire to have more than they currently have. And our system is sort of built around consumerism. We have, you know, a banking system and a credit system that enables people to borrow money to live, you know, ways that they wouldn't be able to do if they had to save up the money in advance. And so it all makes it a bit more complicated than perhaps the old paradigm was. And the other point I was making is I think for all of the, I mean, we certainly have class differences in this country, and they're probably greater than we like to acknowledge, but they're certainly not as the same as or as bad as in somewhere like the UK, where you open your mouth and you're suddenly categorised. But the other point I was also making is that I think that we perhaps don't sort of think about this subject enough in different ways. And the example I was talking about, and we know this has been a huge issue in the United States in recent years, and I think it's probably more of a problem here than we actually talk about, and that is the people who have become homeless as a result of foreclosures. As a result of, in the United States, following the GFC, there was a massive foreclosure movement. So many people were kicked out of their houses because their houses were worth less than they owed on them, and they couldn't afford to keep up the payments. And there were huge numbers of people who lost everything. And so does that make them working class? Does that make them homeless? Does that make them dispossessed? I mean, what do we call people in that situation? And I think that happens here a lot too. And you were giving us the example of the, and I know many examples of this, of a woman, the middle class woman who, you know, in her 50s, the husband, you know, dumps her for a younger model, and she's left with nothing. She has no skills. She hasn't worked in 30 years. She hasn't got the confidence or the skills to get a job. She's kicked out of her house and she has nothing. And I know in Sydney, the largest and fastest growing group of homeless people is middle-aged women. And it's a shocking, shocking problem that's completely invisible.
Alice, as a lawyer and as someone who's had experience of growing up in the working class, what kind of policy do you think, I mean, we're talking backstage about things like access to affordable childcare. Are there any policies that you think would make a huge difference in terms of women and class?
Not in terms of policy, but one thing that really changed my life was I got an education, which a lot of my friends didn't, because they came here when they were a bit too old and they'd grown up in the refugee camps. So they were too old and they ended up working in factories or sewing like their parents did, and having children early. So it's not this transcends race. It's purely class. You grew up in Braybrook. You could be Vietnamese. You could be Australian. If you don't have a high education, if you don't finish high school, it's statistically more likely you'll find a purpose in life in having a child, because you have a child, the world smiles upon you. I discovered that, you know, and then I realised this is what the teen mothers understand, that it gives them a sense of purpose. So I guess education has always been my, you know, has been what saved me. But Maxine, you mentioned something so interesting about class and artists. Could you talk about that? Yeah.
We're talking backstage, I guess, about you know, there are large groups of people in society who have a very high level of education but not necessarily a high income. So, you know, people like writers, you know, like artists, visual artists, or people who, you know, when I finished law school, I went to work in an Indigenous women's legal centre, and, you know, the lawyers there were so badly paid, you know, and so you have this group of people that are potentially from middle class backgrounds who have a very high level of education, but in terms of income, you know, there's this kind of class fluency there, which I think is why it is so hard to pin down class in Australia. And as Alice was saying, you can also have people who are, you know, electricians that are earning, you know, an awful amount of money, whereas 50 years ago, you know, that was considered a trade that you did if you weren't going to university. So there's a great fluency there. One thing I've noticed, I guess, as a single parent is the lack of dialogue. I mean, not necessarily in the media, but just in the general public around rights for single mothers. And I think particularly given our new domestic violence agenda, my thought is always, who's going to support these women? You know, if they leave their partners, particularly if they're working class women, you know, how are we going to legislate when single parent pensions have been stripped back? And how are we going to encourage them to get back into the workforce when they can't afford potentially childcare? Is that something, I mean, you're talking in the misogyny factor about, you know, the necessity of a woman having economic independence. And I think for me that was a big disappointment of the Gillard government, was the stripping back of support for single parents.
Well, I mean, we all know the path to economic and financial independence is to be able to have a job that pays you well. And in order to get a job that pays you well, you need to have qualifications. You need to have education or skills. And that is the fundamental that every person should be aspiring to. And the question that arises, if you don't have those and you're suddenly in life, your life is disrupted by, you know, you become a single parent and you have to rebuild your life. I mean, the big challenge for us as a country is how to make that happen, and how to find the appropriate mixture of retraining and education and giving women enough to live on while that happens. But the purpose should be to try and encourage them into employment and self-sufficiency and all the things that come with having the self-respect and all the rest of it, rather than being reliant on welfare for the rest of their lives. I mean, I think that's got to be the intention, but when you try and achieve that, there's a lot of pushback because people think you're being cruel. So it's a very hard thing to achieve, but I think that's the right policy.
And I think it's interesting as well the way that I think intersectional issues feed into that idea of motherhood. Certainly, I think in your book there's a trend away from stay-at-home parenting as a concept, whereas I know from my background, you know, when you come from a background where, you know, or an Indigenous background where kids have been taken away from their parents. And I remember an aunt of mine, I think I've said on one of these panels before, saying to me, you know, while the white women were out marching for feminism, I was at home looking after their children, which is not literally true. But I mean, I guess it's that concept of where do you place the emphasis? How does culture feed into that? And I'm interested to know from your perspective as well, Alice, you know, you're one of four children, so you know, that concept of working around children and the strength of the family, particularly in migrant communities, I guess, that may not have other people around for support.
Well, I've been very lucky. So both my parents still work. They work at Better Electrical. So in the mornings, my mother wants to see this little guy, so I drive him over and she gives him a bath and she feeds him before work. And then I take him and I write for the rest of the day. He's a very well-behaved little man. But what's so interesting is that my mother's always worked. She's worked since she was 13, and she doesn't understand feminism because of her background. But she said to me, when you have a baby, you should go back to work because that's your purpose. And she said, when I get older, I'll look after your babies for you. So that it's true, in migrant communities, that there is that village that looks after your baby. I remember when he was born, we have a thing called 1 month confinement, which means you have to stay at home for a month and not lift a finger while your aunties and mums come over to help you so that you can recover from childbirth. And if you're fully physically strong, then you can look after the kid pretty well. But it takes a month for you to heal up. And that makes perfect sense. When I was pregnant, I was really angry about it. I said, I'm not going to do that. It's an old wives' tale. Only after having a kid and having aunties bring food, I thought, hey, that's pretty good.
Do you feel, Anne, I know that there's been excellent reviews of the misogyny factor as a book, and it is a great book. I've read it for the second time over the last week. But one of the criticisms has been that critique of stay-at-home parenting, and why can't we value that as a job and value it as a vocation and potentially put a monetary attachment on that as opposed to encouraging women to...
Well, if we're going to do that, I think it should be a job that men do as well. I don't think it should just be a women's job. And for all the reasons, I mean, the three, as you mentioned, two of them, the three essentials for women's, preconditions for women's equality, have I said, financial independence, and all you need to achieve that, ability to control your own fertility, decide when and if you go and how many children you have, and the third thing, freedom from violence. And those three things are absolutely essential for women to have independence and equality. And I think you cannot guarantee those if you don't have the ability to support yourself, and you don't have the ability to, if things don't work out, as Betty Friedan, the great American feminist, used to say, we're all just one husband away from welfare. If things don't work out, you want to be able to have some fallback, and the fallback has got to be, you might be very rich, but you probably won't be. Most of us aren't. So you have to have the ability to support yourself. And I don't say that women shouldn't stay at home. It should be a choice, but it should be a real choice, an informed choice. And at the moment, it isn't. It's a choice that rich people have, but less well-off people don't have, because most people need the money. And therefore, it's an enforced choice. And I think we just make it very difficult for the women for whom there is no choice. We're not having adequate childcare, or childcare is too expensive, and all of the things that we do to make it so difficult.
Absolutely. Okay, we might open it to the audience for some questions. Please don't be shy. There's a microphone on either side of the room, so put your hand up. We've got just under 20 minutes for question time, and a mic will come to you if you raise your hand.
Thank you. To refer to an earlier time of class in this country, I'm 81 years of age. My school years were during the Second World War. I grew up in inner city suburbs in Sydney. The Melbourne equivalent would be places like Fitzroy and Richmond, I'd say. This is what I was aware of as a child there, was that in a street of 20 dwellings, there were only 3 motor vehicles, and they were all utes driven by the men, and no women in that street drove cars. Virtually none of them had work of any kind unless they'd become young women and went off someplace, but most of them were helping to rear children. But the point I want to make, which has been lost, I think it's got to be an aspect of class, was that behind all the rows of little workers' cottages, there are always laneways. When I came to Melbourne years later, I recognised the same little laneways in Carlton and Fitzroy and so forth, and Collingwood. What could happen in those little laneways was that any woman from any one of those houses could go down and into the back gate of anyone else's place. And when you went in the back gate and walked up through the tiny little yard, you went past the laundry, the lavatory, and the next one was the kitchen. And you could go into someone else's kitchen if you're a woman or if you were a child sent there by your mother's instructions. Now, the women in the street shared that with each other, regardless of other aspects of their lives. Like, for instance, I think they were they all Euros? Yes, they were. But regardless of religion. So even though the kids could fight, depending on which school they went to, they could fight amongst themselves. But back home, that back lane, back gate culture was so important, because it meant that you helped out others. And sometimes Mum would send me down to Mrs. So-and-so's, and it would always be Mrs. somebody, and just go up there and knock on it. If you're a bloke, you had to knock on the kitchen door. If you're a woman, you could walk in. But by bloke, I mean a young male. Once you got to adult male status, you didn't do that any longer. You were not welcome to go up that back lane and into anybody else's back gate. But look, that sort of support, and it wasn't simply one street. It was right across suburbs. That kind of activity was happening. We've lost it, I know, but I didn't want to abandon everything of the past. That was such a good thing. I grew up with that, with a sense that my neighbours were that. They were all participants in some of the welfare of my family.
I think, I mean, from my perspective, I feel like there are still variations on that. I mean, maybe there's not that geographical freedom to walk into someone else's kitchen, but for me, certainly, particularly after having kids, you know, that ability to call someone else and say, I can't get to school, can you pick my kid up? Or if someone has a baby, or dropping meals off to them. Or I'm part of a women's online writers group, and a woman posted that she had lost her laptop, or she'd spilt water on her laptop, and she said, you know, I can't afford to buy a new laptop. So everyone in the group put in and bought her a new laptop. And so I feel like that kind of camaraderie still exists, but it's not as out in the open, you know, and that's partly due to the society that we live in. But I mean, I certainly wouldn't walk into my neighbour's kitchen unless I wanted to get arrested. But you know,
depends where you live. I mean,
yeah.
people in the country.
Yeah.
Lots of country areas, people still do that.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, there are. Yeah, it depends on where you live and who your neighbours are and what you know, how well you know them, I guess. But I feel like that sentiment and that camaraderie amongst women is still there. How do you feel about that, Alice? Do you feel like that kind of camaraderie and helping each other out is still there?
Yeah, I definitely feel that it's still there. The local councils have been wonderful with helping women set up mothers groups. So you get put in one after you have a kid, depending on where you live. And I don't remember that happening when my sisters were born, or maybe my mother just didn't join. She didn't have time. She was just working. Yeah.
Anyone else for a question? Please don't be shy.
Hi, my name's Susan. Thank you very much for the talk. I've got a couple of points, and I hope I remember them. Your comment about the children's centre and that people don't tend to say thank you. I don't have children myself, but I know that the people who I've worked with who go to childminding centres, all the people I know have always gone on such a quick tear to the centre. And I think it's usually because the women going there, or the parents going there, are usually in such a rush that they're not grateful for the service, that they're not appreciative of what's happening, that they're just they're just under such pressure. And I think that's usually the case. But my question really is, you've spoken about women who have children and the connectedness between groups that are established for women with children in different classes. Do you think there's a disconnectedness for women in classes who are without children?
Well, speaking as someone without children, I don't think so. I don't feel that at all. But I mean, I think obviously children are one way of connecting if you have them, and particularly when they're young and you have various needs for services and companionship and playgroups and all the various things that you would be doing with your kids and other, I hesitate to say mothers, but I guess it's mothers, and their kids will be doing the same thing, so it makes sense to get together. But I mean, I think that's not the only reason for interacting in this world, and as most of us, well, at least a third of women don't have children, so that would kind of make life pretty miserable if that was the only way you could connect with people. So no, I really don't think that's... I think there are lots of other ways of connecting with people.
Does anyone else have a question? Please raise your hand.
So you opened with the recent news article about the, if I can say, Saviour boy and his rant online. How do you think the growing disparity in educational outcomes between private school and public school students will impact class in Australia going into the future?
Good question.
I think it's always affected class, not just recently, but in the past. If you had money, you would send your son or daughter to, one of those inner city private schools that have been around for a long time. And there you get a very decent education, but you also have... When I went to a private school, I realised how many traditions they had and how a narrative of these traditions really sustains your sense of belonging in the world. You know, if your grandfather went to this school, if your aunt, you have special songs you sing, you have a uniform that's been passed down 100 years. It was very different to the state schools I went to, where the uniform changes according to, you know, affordability, or the uniform was just a tracksuit and you could wear any colour. It's these little things. I found the educational teachers are wonderful everywhere. They're just doing their best with the resources they have, and some teachers have much more resources because the school is wealthier. But the two never quite meet. It was a completely different world at Footscray Girls Secondary College compared to the private school I went to. You never saw the two groups mixing with each other. So I guess this kind of thing still keeps going. And I remember, you know, when my book came out, I got all these letters from young adults, and I got them from private school girls who said, "Oh, I'm not Asian, but I understand the pressures that you write about in this book. Because, you know, after school I do violin, then I do tennis, then I do ballet, and then I go to sleep, and I repeat the same thing." And I have working class students write to me and say, "We are essentially adults. We have adult responsibilities. I'm looking after my sick mum with cancer, or I'm doing all the bills at home, or I'm working at a restaurant until 3 a.m. to help the family out. But we have no rights as adults, and we don't have much of a voice." And usually those letters are full of expletives. So there's a certain way of speaking that you learn at a particular kind of school, which I had to learn. If you come from the working class area of Braybrook, you pepper your language sometimes with expletives without realising that it sounds really foul. It doesn't it? So it's true. And this is a class you have to learn these things. Yeah.
Well, I'd just like to comment on that. I think it's a really very important point that you've raised, a very, very good question, because, I mean, what's happened in this country, particularly over the past, since the mid-90s, I guess, since the Howard government, when there was deliberate steering away of money from public education into private education, and that has happened at such a huge rate, and the amount of money that's now spent on private education now outweighs the amount of money that's spent on universities, which I think is scandalous. And I think the attempts by the Gillard government to redress that with the Gonski concept, and that is, needs-based education where every child attracts money, whatever school they're at, and that's now being ditched by the current government. And so what we're going to be seeing is the creation of classes of a kind we've never had before, and the entrenchment of those classes in a way that's going to, God knows what the implications of that are for our country, but it's a terrible thing to be embarking upon, in the early years of the 21st century, when this, we would have thought that the 20th century was when we tried to leave behind all this systemic inequality, not to be creating new paths to it, and that's what we seem to be doing at the moment.
Does anyone else have a question?
Hi, I'm Sandy. I'll just start with a little golfing quip. I married a golfer, and at the beginning I was really jealous about all the time he spent there, and by 17 years later I couldn't wait for him to keep on going. And no, I'm not still married. I am interested in the discussion about education. A little thought bubble I had a few weeks ago, and I'm sure it wasn't me who came up with it. I must have been listening to Radio National. But the business of, we fund public schools, we fund religious schools, and we fund high-income schools, whatever grammars they are. Are we building a group of young people who don't know how to talk to each other anymore? If you go to a religious school, then you almost learn to become a homophobe. If you go to a grammar, then you will be unkind to people who don't have a high income. And I have a real sense of, because I've been involved with all three, that culture, that focus on education separates us, and it separates the children that we're going to create and the values that they grow up with. And I just don't think it's healthy.
Well, I don't necessarily think you'd become a homophobe if you go to religious schools, because I went to 5 different high schools, and I went to a Catholic one, and that was the one school that actually was the kindest school. It didn't have very much money. It was in Braybrook, but it collected, you collected cans for the Red Cross, and these were very low income earning families who were taught that they had to give because it was a decent thing to do. I'd like to say it depends on individual families how a kid turns out, but I've also visited schools where the culture is all about academic success, or it's all about this veneer of success. So in some schools, students have severe eating disorders, they are highly stressed, they have attempts at their own lives. But the school has a complete veneer of success. They have duxes on the walls, and you do get a creepy sense of disconnect when you talk with the administrative staff and then you talk with the students, a completely different place. So the school's culture does shape the individual, I think, to a large extent. But blanketly, not all religious schools teach homophobia, I don't think.
I think as well, there is an underestimated upper middle class that choose not to send their children to private schools. And that was a comment that came from one of my neighbours when we were discussing the Xavier issue was, well, that's why we don't send our children to a private school, because we want them to be exposed, even though we might be able to afford it, we want them to be exposed to everybody. We don't want them to have access to something that other people don't have access to just from an accident of birth or because they don't have the same kind of education. So, from my perspective, I think, that the private school issue, even though there is more funding going to private schools, I don't know, maybe that's my idealism. I like to think that
the great irony, Maxine, is that you do have these wonderful parents who send their kids to public schools even though they could afford private schools. In my experience, though, my father sent me to a private school, not only for the education, but so that I would mix with the kids of doctors and lawyers. And when I finished and we had a valedictory dinner, we sat at a table and you could see such disappointment in the parents' eyes. All of them, my Greek friend, my Russian friend, my Turkish friend and my Vietnamese friend, all their parents, such disappointment, and we didn't understand why. And my dad drove me home and he said, look, we spent so much money and you spent 2 years hanging around the ethnics. Why did you... But they were the people who understood me in my home life, so... Absolutely. We might end on that note, unfortunately. We're out of time, but I think that's a great place to end. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. Please thank Leo, Alice and Anne.